Years ago when I was a kid, I went trick-or-treating with my cousin Chris. What started as a night of candy and costumes was about to become the most terrifying Halloween of my life. We were super close, like practically brothers. See, Chris's mom, my aunt, worked crazy hours, and he didn't have a dad around. So he was always at our place, and we kinda grew up together. This Halloween was gonna be extra special, because we'd been planning our costumes for weeks. We started out in my neighborhood, which was actually pretty big. There were tons of houses, and it was right by this big patch of woods. Chris's neighborhood was much smaller, which is why we always started at my place. My dad drove us to pick up Chris from his house first. It was only like a 10-minute drive, but it felt way longer because we were so excited. When we got to Chris's house, his mom was just leaving for work. She looked pretty tired, but gave us both a big hug before she left. My dad chatted with her for a bit, and then we all piled back into the car. Chris and I were in the back seat, already comparing our plastic Halloween buckets and talking about all the candy we were going to get. After we got back to my place, my dad went inside, and Chris and I began going to all of the houses on my street. The street went back quite a ways and curved around a lot as well. It almost seemed never-ending. It took us a long time, but finally we were able to go to all of the houses on it. Our Halloween buckets were getting super heavy, but we weren't satisfied. We wanted more. Chris and I have always been competitive guys. We would weigh our Halloween candy when we got back home to see whose was heavier. I don't really know why we did that, because if we all went to the same houses, technically, they should have been roughly the same, but it was still fun to see. So, after we reached the end of my street and went to all of the houses, there was a sort of busier street there. It was by the woods and was quiet, with no cars on it at the time. We walked on the side of it until we got to another neighborhood, which only took us about a minute to get there. Then we entered that neighborhood and started going to more and more houses. We went for probably another hour, and finally, it got really late. People stopped answering the doors, and more houses had their lights off. Finally, we decided to go back home. The only problem was, by then we had gone so far out that we weren't quite sure how to get back to my house. The last neighborhood we were in was very large, with several curving streets. Especially with it being night, it was really confusing. We thought we knew how to get back at first, but quickly found out that we didn't. After about 10 minutes of walking around, we realized that we were lost. Neither of us had a cell phone back then, so we had to figure it out on our own. We knew that we weren't all that far off, but we just didn't know exactly where or how to get back. We walked down a few streets, and then we came across that large stretch of woods on one side. I said that we should cut through the woods, as I thought that my neighborhood was on the other side somewhere. The woods were very dense and thick. It was also really dark in there. It seemed a little bit scary, but Chris was okay with it, liking the idea of a bit of an adventure on Halloween. We both entered the woods and started walking. We had nothing to shine light and make it easier to see. We were just walking straight ahead and occasionally getting hit with tree branches, but we pressed on. About a minute or two in, we heard a noise behind us. It sounded like somebody was walking through the woods a ways back. It didn't make any sense for anyone to be out there. We looked behind us but couldn't really see anything at first. We kept going and tried to go faster. I'm not going to lie, I was pretty scared. We kept going and continued to hear the people behind us. Chris and I then both stopped and listened. Whoever it was behind us stopped as well, and things became silent for a second. Then they started walking again, closer to us. Within a few seconds, two figures came into view. I couldn't see them very well because it was so dark, but I knew they were adults, and I knew I didn't recognize them. They were wearing some kind of matching Halloween costumes, but in the darkness, I couldn't make out what they were supposed to be. Chris called out to them, but they didn't answer. We then both started running through the woods as fast as we could. We could hear the two people running behind us when we did. I didn't look back, and I tried not to pay attention to the sound of them running. After probably a minute of this, we finally made it out of the woods. It was a great feeling, and even better, I realized that we were in fact in my neighborhood now, and not far from my street at all. We finally slowed down and stopped to look back at the woods. We were a little ways away now, and thought that the men had stopped chasing us. But that's when we saw them emerge from the woods. They weren't running or chasing after us, but they did see us. As soon as we saw them, we took off running again. They didn't seem to follow us, thankfully. We were able to make it back to my house safely. We burst through the front door, startling my parents who were watching TV in the living room. My dad jumped up, asking what was wrong. Between gasps for air, we managed to tell him about the two men chasing us through the woods. He immediately went to the window to look outside, to double-check that we weren't followed home. My mom called the police while my dad went outside to check more thoroughly around the house. The police came and talked to us, but they didn't find anyone in the area matching our description. They told us to be careful and to call if we saw the men again. After they left, Chris and I were still pretty shaken up. We didn't even care about weighing our candy anymore. We just sat in my room, talking about what happened and trying to make sense of it all. That night, Chris slept over in my room. Neither of us wanted to be alone after what happened. As we lay there in the dark, trying to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder who those men were and why they were chasing us. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and it definitely changed how I felt about Halloween and those woods near our house. I used to go trick-or-treating every year as a kid with my twin sister Anne. What started as a fun night of candy hunting turned into the most terrifying Halloween of our lives. We did pretty much everything together, and Halloween was always our favorite time of year. So, on this one fateful Halloween, when we were 14, we went trick-or-treating around our neighborhood. We always kind of did the same route, and went to just about every house that we could walk to. We would stay out for hours and end up getting lots of candy. On this year, we went late into the night. I don't really know what time it was, but probably after 8:30 p.m. Towards the end, we came up to this one house. There was a really long driveway, I remember, and as we approached, Anne said that we should turn back. The lights were all off except for a small one on the front step. This generally meant that the homeowner either wasn't home or wasn't going to answer the door. But then I noticed something weird. The front door was wide open, and there was a sign taped to it. We went up to the door where the homemade sign was. It said, "Come in for candy." Now obviously this sounds kind of weird, and it did to us at the time as well, but we were curious. We looked at each other, shrugged, and decided to check it out. I mean, we were 14, so we thought we were pretty much grown-ups. When we stepped inside, the house was mostly dark, but we could see there was a dim light coming from what looked like the living room. Honestly, it gave me the creeps. I didn't know if that was what the people wanted or what, but it was super creepy. We could hear the sound of a TV or something coming from that room. As we got closer to the living room, we saw this massive projector screen taking up almost an entire wall. There was a horror movie playing on it. I think it was one of those Saw movies. The volume was pretty low, but it was still freaky. That's when we noticed someone sitting on the couch watching the movie. The person turned around, and I swear, my heart nearly stopped. It was a man in this super creepy Michael Myers costume from the Halloween movies. With that pale mask and the jumpsuit, it was terrifying. He just sat there, staring at us for a second, then he stood up. He asked us if we wanted to join him and watch the movie. His voice was all muffled behind the mask, and it made it even creepier. Anne and I just kind of froze. We didn't know what to say. It was just so weird that someone would invite kids to watch a horror movie on Halloween night. I managed to stammer out that we should probably get going. That's when things got really weird. The guy suddenly got all angry. He said something real creepy, along the lines of, "You get candy, but I get no candy in return. That's no fair." He told us we were being selfish, and that we owed him for the candy. Anne grabbed my arm and whispered that we should leave. We started backing away towards the front door, but the guy in the Michael Myers costume started following us. He was getting more and more worked up, saying stuff like we couldn't just take without giving something back. As soon as we got out the front door, we started running. I looked back and saw the guy coming after us. He wasn't running super fast because of the costume, I guess, but he was definitely chasing us. Anne and I were freaking out. We didn't want to lead this creep back to our house, so we decided to take a detour. We ran down the street. The sound of heavy footsteps behind us spurred us on. We cut through someone's front yard. The streets were a maze in the dark, familiar by day, but alien and threatening at night. We turned down one street, then another, trying to lose him in the twists and turns of the neighborhood. At one point, we ducked behind a parked car, crouching low and trying to calm down and catch our breath. We could hear the man's footsteps getting closer. He wasn't running anymore, but walking slowly. The sound of his breathing, muffled by the mask, was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. Just when we thought he was about to discover us, this cat ran out from under the car, startling us both. The cat's sudden movement seemed to distract the man. We heard his footsteps move away, and after a few tense moments, we decided to make a run for it again. We sprinted across the street and into someone's backyard. It was dark, and we could barely see where we were going. I tripped over something, probably a garden hose, and went sprawling. I am the clumsy one in the family. Anne helped me up quickly, both of us looking around for any sign of the man in the Michael Myers costume. We couldn't see him, but we sure could hear him. He was calling out now, his voice a sinister sing-song that sent chills down my spine. He was saying something about playing hide-and-seek, and how he was going to find us eventually. Anne and I exchanged terrified glances. This guy was seriously unhinged. We kept moving, our legs burning with exhaustion. We'd never run so far or so fast in our lives. Every house we passed was oblivious to the terror unfolding on their streets. A part of me wanted to pound on someone's door and beg for help, but I was too scared to stop moving. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, we finally couldn't hear him anymore. We'd reached a part of the neighborhood we didn't know too well, full of winding cul-de-sacs and unfamiliar houses. We slowed to a walk, both of us gasping for air. We decided to wait a bit longer before heading home, just to make sure the creepy guy wasn't still around. We talked about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. It seemed so surreal, like something out of a horror movie, which, given the guy's costume, was probably the point. Eventually, we made our way home. We were exhausted and still pretty freaked out. When we got there, we told our parents what had happened. They were really worried and called the police. The cops came and took our statements, but they never found the guy. The owners of the house where the man in the Michael Myers costume had been were apparently overseas at the time, meaning whoever he was, he had no business being there. After that Halloween, our parents got us cell phones for Christmas. They said it was so we could always call for help if we needed it. Anne and I still went trick-or-treating the next year, but we were a lot more careful. We never went into anyone's house again. The next year, that same house was fully decorated for Halloween, and the actual owners were out front, happily handing out candy, as if nothing strange had ever happened. Still, as we walked up to the door, I couldn't help but feel a chill, remembering the man in the Michael Myers costume. I don't know who that guy in the Michael Myers costume was, or what he really wanted. Whatever it was, it made for the scariest Halloween that I've ever had. Even now, years later, I still get creeped out when I see a Michael Myers costume. So this crazy thing happened on Halloween when I was a kid. It was supposed to be just a fun scavenger hunt, but it turned into this weird chase around town. My friend and I were all excited about this Halloween scavenger hunt thing our small town was doing. My Uncle Frank was visiting, and he's kinda odd. He's got this old converted hearse he kept from when he used to own a funeral home, and he said he'd drive us around for the hunt. It was pretty cool because it was cold out, and the clues were all over town. Not to mention that the hearse suited that Halloween mood we were all in. We started out checking the spots on my street. There was this big old tree at the end of the road where we had to find the first clue. It was stuck in this knothole, and my friend had to really reach in to get it. Then we went to old Mrs. Lopez's house. She always goes all out for Halloween, and we had to count all the pumpkins on her porch. There were like 20 of them, all different sizes. After that, Uncle Frank drove us down the busy road to the other side of town. We hit up the library first. The librarian, she was dressed up as a witch, kept cackling at us while we looked for this really old book. It took forever to find it, but the clue was inside, telling us to go to the old mill next. The mill was pretty creepy. It's been abandoned for years, and there were cobwebs everywhere. We had to find this symbol painted on one of the big millstones. It was super dark in there, and we kept tripping over stuff. I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but it was probably just a rat or something. Next up was the old train station. We had to count all the boarded up windows, which was kind of boring. But then we found this old train schedule from like 100 years ago, and that was pretty cool. The clue there sent us to the town square. The town square has this big fountain with a weird statue. We had to find a clue in the statue's mouth, which was gross. My friend had to stick her whole arm in there to get it. While we were doing that, we saw a bunch of other kids running around with flashlights, all trying to solve the clues too. We were making pretty good time, so Uncle Frank drove us to this area of town I'd never been to before. It had more clues, and they were closer together. We went to this old covered bridge first. It was really dark and echoey inside. We had to do a rubbing of this carving on one of the beams to get the next clue. After solving a few more clues, we headed back to the hearse. That's when we noticed this car behind us. At first, we didn't think much of it. Uncle Frank pulled over to let them pass, but they pulled over too. They weren't right behind us, just a little ways back. We drove to the next spot, which was this creepy old house on a hill. The clue was hidden somewhere in the overgrown garden. While we were looking, I kept feeling like someone was watching us. When we got back to the hearse, that car was still there. Uncle Frank drove us to the next location, and the car followed. We went to the old cemetery, where we had to find the town founder's grave for a clue. It was super spooky with all the old gravestones and statues. The car just sat at the entrance the whole time, not moving. By now, we were all wondering what was up with this car. We couldn't see who was driving, just headlights. Uncle Frank decided to try and lose them. He started driving all over town, taking random turns and stuff. But no matter what he did, the car kept following us. We ended up back in our neighborhood, and the car was still there. Uncle Frank drove to the end of my street, which is a dead end. No pun intended. He went around the circle, and the car did the same thing. Now we knew for sure they were following us, and it was getting kind of scary. We asked Uncle Frank if we should stop and run inside to call the cops, since this was before cell phones were a thing. But he shook his head, saying it wasn't a good idea to lead them directly to our house. Uncle Frank then drove out to the main road. The car got closer behind us. He turned onto this quiet street, but the car was still right there. At the end of that street, there was another quiet road. We went left, and yep, they went left too. Then Uncle Frank did this quick U-turn and went back to the road we were just on. He drove back to the main road, and the car was still following, but a bit further back now. We were all trying to figure out who it could be and why they were following us. Just when we were running out of ideas, we saw a cop car on the main road. Uncle Frank got right behind it, and finally, the car that was following us turned off and left. We were all super relieved. Uncle Frank drove us home, and we didn't see the mystery car again. The next day, we finished up the scavenger hunt. It wasn't as exciting as the night before, but we still had fun. We never found out who was in that car or why they were following us. but it sure made for a Halloween we'll never forget. This is only a short story, but it was very frightening for me at the time. It happened when I was about 10 years old, on Halloween night. I was out trick-or-treating with my best friend, Tommy. We were both dressed up as superheroes. I was Batman, and he was Superman. We started out in my street, which was actually pretty small. There were only like 10 houses in it, and we went to all of them within like 15 minutes or less. After that, we decided to head to the next street over, where there were more houses and supposedly better candy. As we were walking, I noticed something weird. There was this clown following us. Now, I don't mean like a kid dressed up as a clown for Halloween. This was a full-on adult clown, with the white face paint, red nose, and big floppy shoes. He wasn't going up to any houses or anything. He was just following us. At first, I tried to ignore it. I mean, it was Halloween, right? Weird stuff happens. But after a while, it started to really freak me out. Every time we'd go up to a house, I'd look back, and there he was, just standing there, watching us. I whispered to Tommy about it, and he saw the clown too. We decided to walk a little faster, thinking maybe we could lose him. But no matter how fast we went, he always seemed to be right there, a little ways behind us. After about 30 minutes of this, I was really starting to panic. My heart was racing, and I was having trouble catching my breath. You see, I have pretty bad asthma, and the fear and all the walking were starting to trigger an attack. We turned down another street, hoping to get away from the clown, but he just kept following. By this point, I was wheezing pretty badly. Tommy was getting scared too, not just because of the clown, but because he knew about my asthma. That's when I realized I'd forgotten my inhaler at home. I was so excited about trick-or-treating that I'd completely forgotten to bring it. Now here I was, having an asthma attack, being chased by a creepy clown, and no inhaler in sight. Tommy and I stopped walking. I couldn't go any further. I was struggling to breathe, and the panic was making it even worse. Tommy was trying to calm me down, but I could see he was freaking out too. Just when I thought things couldn't get any scarier, this guy came running up to us. For a second, I thought it was the clown, and I nearly passed out. But it wasn't. It was just a regular guy, looked like someone's dad. He asked if I was okay, and Tommy explained about my asthma attack. Turns out, this guy was an off-duty paramedic who lived nearby. He'd seen us from his porch and realized something was wrong. The paramedic guy knew exactly what to do. He helped me sit down and talked me through some breathing exercises. He even had a spare inhaler in his car that he ran to get. But even after using it, I wasn't getting much better. My breathing was still really labored, and I was starting to feel dizzy. The paramedic didn't waste any time. He called 911 right away. While we waited for the ambulance, he stayed with us, monitoring my breathing and keeping me as calm as possible. Tommy was freaking out, but the paramedic got him to call my parents. When the ambulance arrived, things moved really fast. They put an oxygen mask on me and gave me some kind of breathing treatment. The ride to the hospital is mostly a blur. I just remember being scared and wishing I could breathe normally. At the hospital, the doctors said I'd had a severe asthma attack. They kept me overnight, giving me more treatments and monitoring my breathing. My parents were there, looking worried sick. Tommy's parents brought him to visit the next day, and he told me the clown had disappeared during all the commotion. I ended up staying in the hospital for 2 days before they let me go home. To this day, I don't know who that clown was or why he was following us. Maybe he was just some creep trying to scare kids on Halloween, or maybe it was someone's idea of a prank that went too far. Whatever it was, it definitely ruined Halloween for me that year. I'm just glad that paramedic guy was there. If he hadn't shown up when he did, things could have gotten a lot worse. After that, I never forgot my inhaler again, especially not on Halloween. And yeah, to this day, I still can't look at clowns without feeling a little short of breath.